I want to talk a little bit about pollution as well. You talked
Okay.
about the fishing nets. Yeah, and the number I saw was like 10% of all the plastic in the ocean comes from the fishing industry. Like, I honestly, I got a little angry reading that
Yeah.
statistic, and that it's especially bad because it's nets that are made for capturing fish, so they're particularly destructive. And then that you mentioned that it's plastic now as opposed to maybe natural materials before, so it's not biodegradable or not nearly as biodegradable. Yeah, so could you talk about just maybe the pollution from the fishing industry, but also just pollution in general and the impact that has on fish populations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think pollution is an important element also in the health of the oceans. And so pollution comes from many different origins, and it's not just plastic pollution. Although I have to say I'm particularly interested in plastic pollution because I have a long-standing interest in the fishing industry, and they are, like you said, they are partly responsible for some of the plastic pollution in the ocean. But there are other causes for pollution, human activity in general, things like agricultural effluents and chemical effluents. Also the maritime industry, there's a lot of marine traffic that has nothing to do with fishing, it's just for transport, or other uses like military vessels and so on. So there's a lot of pollution that comes from from vessels as well. And also some of it is climatic, from rain and thermal and noise pollution and so on. So yes, I think all pollution in the ocean is bad news for different ways, but plastic pollution in general, I think, has a particularly detrimental effect on fish stocks. Some plastic pollution types are bad because they cause entanglement. So fishing gear, fragments of fishing gear that are either thrown in the ocean or are lost, they will cause entanglement and can cause damage to stocks for a long time. A lot of the time we don't understand with certainty the damage that this type of marine pollution causes, because sort of from what we know, we think, for example, fishing nets that are either lost or discarded and continue to drift in the ocean can cause entanglement and continue to catch fish. But then after a while, maybe a few weeks or a few months, they will become heavy and they will sink to the marine soil and they will stop hunting fish. But then after all the organic material has rotted, it is believed that some of them maybe will refloat and will continue to catch. They were designed to catch fish, so that's what they do. With
And turtles
macroplastics,
and
they
dolphins
absolutely,
and sort of the famous ones that you
turtles.
see.
Absolutely, turtles, cetaceans, they are, like we said earlier, this is non-discriminating gear, so they will kill anything they encounter. And so these are basically macroplastics. So they are large pieces of plastic that can have an impact on species and on the environment in different ways. But then over time, macroplastics degrade and they become microplastics. And then they then begin a sort of strange second life as food, as marine food. They will be ingested by the tiny little organisms, and these organisms often provide food for larger fish, and so plastic enters the trophic chain of these animals, and often has the potential to end on our plates as well, because larger predator fish that we value, like tuna, swordfish and others, will eat the smaller fish that have ingested the plastic. So this is how marine pollution basically ends on our plates.
Yeah, I know that the microplastics has a lot of people particularly concerned because the big pieces you kind of figure you just have some mechanism that goes and grabs it, and it doesn't seem especially complicated that way. But the microplastics, people, at least from what I hear, people don't really even see a solution yet, and the fish basically they don't understand that this new thing in their environment. They just see the shiny thing and go and eat it. And you see pictures of like people who cut open the fish guts and it's just plastic inside, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, even larger plastics, they can also be ingested by cetaceans, and it will eventually kill them because it blocks their digestive systems. So yeah, it's not just about entanglement, with the longer, larger fishing gear and so on, but smaller pieces of macroplastics, things like bags. They sometimes can resemble certain marine species that fish will look at. So, like jellies, they will think a bag is a jelly and they will try to eat it. And then that, unfortunately, can be fatal because it can block the digestive systems of these animals. And increasingly, the cetacean strandings, that we hear about, increasingly they have plastic in their intestines and stomach.
Let's do a little bit of climate change as well. We've been talking about pollution, but there's some broader issues of climate change and the heating of the oceans, changing the chemistry a little bit. Yeah, could you talk about the impact of that? And then, so when we're talking about the sustainability and declining fish populations, do you know, or do scientists know which one has the bigger impact, whether it's these fishing practices and overfishing or pollution, climate change? I mean, these are all big factors.
They are all big factors, but I would say the fishing industry clearly has the greatest impact because the fishing industry, whether it's done sustainably or unsustainably, has a direct and immediate and obvious impact on fish stocks because fishing is removing stocks from the water. But in any event, it is a very large industry, difficult to fully appraise and understand, difficult to fully quantify the impacts that it has. And like I said earlier, some of those impacts are not fully scrutinized and often not well understood. So yes, I think there is consensus in looking at the fishing industry as probably at this point in time, probably the most significant source of impacts for the ocean. Yes.
Yeah, and maybe some environments are more susceptible than others, I suppose, to the climate change. The coral reefs are like the famous ones that we're losing those, and that's primarily pollution and climate change as opposed to the fishing. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. You're always going to have some regions and some types of ecosystems that are more susceptible to temperature changes, and also pollution and so on. And unfortunately, marine environment stresses are developing really quickly, plastic pollution developing really quickly, climate change too. So in a few years' time, we might be revisiting this conversation and we might be thinking actually things have changed since then. Certainly with climate change, I think everybody's looking forward with the expectation that it will have significant impact in the way we fish, in the way in which the activities take place, where they take place, where the fish migrate, how the stocks might move, and whether some of them might be able to adapt and survive or not. So yes, I think significant changes are expected in coming years and decades. But at this point in time, I would say that fishing that is badly managed or not managed is a more significant source of stress for the ocean right now.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. One of the news stories that made me interested in talking about this was that here, our last crabbing season in Alaska, which is like a big deal for getting the crab, this one time a year. They just canceled it because they didn't have, I guess the stock was there. Do you know if that was from overfishing or from environmental? Because I know, again, talking about these specific ecosystems, kind of the ends, the cold regions, those are really affected by just slight warming.
Yes, absolutely. I think some species are really sensible to changes in environmental elements, and certainly temperature, currents. Also, when they move, they can affect species. And I think it's also important to remember that When we manage fisheries, like I said earlier, we have to kind of balance interests that are sometimes opposed. So on the one hand, you have the need for conservation and management, but within those margins, people will want to catch as much as they can to be able to make ends meet. But there is a very important principle in fisheries governance, which is a precaution, the precautionary principle. And I think this principle comes into play, particularly when the signs are not good. So, when scientists begin to warn that the stock may be decreasing or that it's not behaving in the way that they would have anticipated, then it is really, really important to proceed with precaution, because the behavior of fish stocks is not always possible to anticipate. And whether a stock moves because of changes in temperature, changes in habitat, or whether it collapses because it hasn't survived those changes or the pressures of fishing, ultimately sometimes it's not possible to predict what's going to happen. And so it is super important to be careful and adopt a precautionary approach in the way we manage these stocks.